Bibles and open up with me to Genesis chapter 12. Genesis chapter 12 is where we are this morning. And as you're turning there, thanks again, Paul, for a great number. Man, it's like you read my text. Faith and grace in the same song, and that's what we're going to discover this morning in the lives of the patriarchs. Now, before we get into that, just let me review a little bit where we are. I know Scott spoke about our reading plan before we got started. But if you look in that fellowship together, you're going to see that there's two columns. One is the Bible in a year. One is a key chapter. If you're struggling to keep up with the Bible in a year, then just go back and read the key chapter. But just kind of stay up with us, if you would, because as you do that, each week, I'm going to kind of give you some guidance into what you'll be reading that week. So it's great if you could kind of stay with us in that regard. Last week, we talked about, this is some things to look for this week in your reading, okay? Look for the dangers favoritism poses with the family. Right? These things repeat themselves, particularly in the patriarchs in Genesis 12 through 50. So look at kind of the favoritism and then do some self-evaluation there. Look at how God uses imperfect people. It's one of the things that I love about the Bible is that it isn't perfect people. These are people with problems. These are people who have challenges. These are people who repeat the same failure again and again. Has anybody here ever repeated the same failure more than once? Okay, good. You're in good company. You're with the people in the Bible. Okay, so you're going to see some of that even today. So look for how God uses imperfect people. Finally, look for similarities to your life and circumstances. So that's one of the ways that the Bible becomes alive to us, is when we look and say, hey, what does the word say there? And wow, that really helps me where I am today, okay? So last week, if you were with us, we talked about the fact that the book of Genesis, you can think of in terms of 4 events and 4 people. Years ago, I learned this pattern, and it's helped me, so I'm hopeful that it will help you as well, okay? So creation, fall, flood, the nations. That's how we remember the first 4 events, Genesis 1 through 11. And the last 4 are captured in 4 people, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph. Now, here's what I want you to do. Put your hands together. Remember, we learned this last week, okay? So just do it with me. Humor me here, okay? So make something with your hands. Creation, fall, flood, let the waters come up, and then spread them, the nations. Okay, one more time. Creation, fall, flood, the nations. Okay, so that's how we remember the first 4 events: creation, fall, flood, and the nations. And we talked about that last week. Maybe if I can just take a minute and review that. Creation. In the beginning, God created heaven and earth and made man in his image. Okay, so this is just summarizing a few things we learned last week. Fall. With one choice, Adam sentenced all of humanity to separation from God. So when Adam made the choice in the garden to sin, and Eve did as well, in that moment, we were separated from God. Flood. With the flood, God destroyed life, but showed grace to Noah and his family. This is important. Noah wasn't chosen simply to be in the ark because he was blameless. That comes later. But Genesis 6:8 speaks of the fact that before that, verse 9 and 10, God brought his favor to Noah. Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord, is the way one translation renders it. And finally, nations. With the confusion of the language, God dispersed people around the world. So that answers a lot of questions for us as human beings: where we came from, why we are the way we are, how God generated various nations and various people. It answers a lot of those things. Now, Abraham struggled, Isaac struggled, Jacob struggled, Joseph struggled. Here's my question. Do you struggle? Okay, then you're in good company, okay? Abraham struggled with fear. Isaac struggled with control. Jacob struggled with deception. And Joseph struggled with patience. So let's just take a look at Genesis chapter 12. Genesis chapter 12. And we start the reading there in the life of Abraham in Genesis 12, because we read this. Now the Lord said to Abram, his name will be changed later, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's household to the land," there's your first thing, "that I will show you, and I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing." So I find that there's 3 things that Abraham is promised here by God. First thing is land. You're going to have land, but he's not there yet, okay? How many of you have moved at some stage in your life? Can I see your hands? How many of you followed a father or a husband who moved when you said, "Why are we packing up?" And he said, "I don't know where we're going. We're just moving." Anybody here? Okay. But Sarah did, right? Sarah didn't know where they were going. They were just going, okay? And so she followed Abram, and God sent him into a land that he was about to give him. But note this, he didn't have the land yet. Oh, and he's going to make him a great nation, but he doesn't have any kids yet. Oh, and he's going to make him a blessing to all the nations or all the families of the earth, but he's going to die at some stage, and he doesn't have any kids yet to be a blessing to all the families in the earth. Right? All of this has to be received on Abraham's part by faith. So here's how we remember this. Abraham struggled with fear. God's grace brought him faith. Okay? You say, well, how do you know he struggled with fear? I mean, he's just this guy who operates by faith. Well, jump with me to Hebrews chapter 11 first. Let's just square up his faith, and then we'll come back and look at his fear. Hebrews chapter 11. In Hebrews 11, we find this, that's at the back of the Bible, by the way. We find this great definition of faith. Now, faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. So think about this for a second. Abraham has been promised he's going to have land, a whole country, by the way. He's going to have a nation. People are going to become a nation. And not only that, he's going to be a blessing to all the nations or families of the earth. Okay? But he sees none of those things presently. He has no land. He has no children. He has no means to be a blessing to all the people of the earth. And so all of this is something that he doesn't see, but that he believes by faith. Now look at verse 8. You'll see it. Hebrews 11, verse 8. By faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called out to a place he was to receive as an inheritance. And he went out, I love this, not knowing where he was going. Okay? That's the perfect man, and he didn't ask for directions either. Okay? He didn't know where he was going, and he didn't have directions. Here we go, verse 9. By faith, he went to live in the land of promise, in a foreign land, living in tents with Isaac and Jacob, heirs with him of the same promise. Okay? So here's your great picture. He didn't have land, he didn't have a people, he didn't have a nation, and yet God said, I will give you those things, and he stepped out by faith. Now go back with me to Genesis chapter 12, because along the road you get a chance to see Abraham act in fear. Here's what we find. Abraham has this really beautiful wife, and as he moves around, he's a little concerned because he doesn't have an army following him. He's a little concerned that maybe someone will meet his wife, and they'll say, hey, we really like her, but she's got a husband, so the way we get her to marry us is to kill the husband. And so that's kind of how Abraham's thinking. So because he's consumed by that fear, look what he says. Genesis chapter 12. When he was about to enter Egypt, okay, he said to Sarah, his wife, I know that you are a woman beautiful in appearance. And when the Egyptians see you, they will say, this is his wife. Then they will kill me, but they will let you live. Say you are my sister. Okay, now this is a really, really cowardly act. Okay? Listen, I will jeopardize my wife to save my life. Okay? Cowardly act. Right? But fear does that at times, doesn't it? When you and I are afraid, have we not acted in a way that we wish we wouldn't have acted? Okay. So Abraham does this thing. Say you are my sister, that it may go well with me because of you, and that my life may be spared for your sake. Now, Abraham lies, God intervenes. That's an incredible act of grace. And says to the leader of Egypt, listen, that man's another man's wife. Don't bring her into your household as your wife. And then that individual comes back and says, hey, listen, Abraham, what are you doing? And Abraham should have figured this out. Even when I lie, God wakes these people up in a dream or something and tells them the truth, right? That I lied. But guess what? He didn't learn that. In fact, we find out that he not only lied there, but he lied here, Genesis chapter 20. Now he's someplace else, facing a leader by the name of Ahimelech, and he looks at that leader, and Abraham said to Sarah, his wife, she is my sister. But this is years later, right? Abraham, stop doing this. But in his fear, he lies again. I don't know about you, but I have found that when I am tempted to lie, and when I talk to people who have lied, almost every time it is in some way related to fear. Right? They're afraid of what somebody will think of them. They're afraid of what somebody will do to them. They're afraid of what someone will believe about them, and so they lie. Here's what I want you to see. Abraham struggled with fear. and yet he also practiced his faith. Let me give it to you another way. I found this wonderful acrostic about fear. Here is what it is. Fear is false evidence appearing real. Okay? The things that Abraham was afraid of, let's just think about this. They'll see my beautiful wife and they'll kill me. Okay? With Pharaoh in Egypt, did that come true? Answer? No. False evidence appearing real. With Ahimelech, much later, did that happen? Answer? No. In fact, go with me to Genesis 20 and look at this. This is really amazing. In Genesis chapter 20, when Abraham is caught in the lie here, look at verse 10. Genesis 20, verse 10. And Abimelech said to Abraham, what did you see that you did this thing, right? Why did you do this? And Abraham said, I did it because I thought, okay, that was his first mistake. He thought separately of the way that God would think. There is no fear of God at all in this place, and they will kill me because of my wife. Okay? But look at what they actually did. Look at verse 8, chapter 20, verse 8. After he'd had the dream, Abimelech rose early in the morning and called all his servants and told them all these things. What? That Abraham was married to Sarah and that they shouldn't be messing with her and they shouldn't take her as their wives because she was already married, right? And the men, I love this, were very much afraid. Right? The very thing that Abraham thought, they have no fear of God. The moment one of their leaders has a dream and says, God spoke to me, and listen, we better not mess with that woman because she's another man's wife, they're all really, really afraid. Right? This is really important to capture. When you and I face things that we're afraid of, more often than not, those things aren't probably going to happen. Okay? They're not going to happen. I don't know if you've ever been in a car accident. I have been in a few in my life. And they were always somebody else's fault, I'm sure. Okay? But I know this, that when I've been in one, for a while after I've been in one, in my garage, I get in my car, I put the key in the car, and for one moment, I just hear things like slide and crash and airbags pop. Okay? And I'm always reminded, listen, it feels like that's going to happen. Like for me to just back out of the garage, that's going to happen. And when I come to intersections and I stop and I look, I can sometimes even still hear that stuff happen again, right? But in the time that I've had an accident the last time until I have my next one, all right? So here's the thing, I haven't had any accidents, right? And I've driven a lot of miles. Why? Because it feels real, but it's not real. Many of the things we fear really will not happen. Now, Abraham overcomes those things by acting in faith. God said, listen, I'm going to give you land. It's not here yet, Lord. Go. I'm going to give you children. They're not here yet. I know you're 90 years old. You're almost 100 years old. You'll have children. I'm going to give you a nation. You will become a great nation. I'm going to bless all the people of the world through someone who will be your heir, Jesus Christ, one day. Though you will not live to see it, 2,000 years from now it will happen. Abraham acted on faith. Okay? But what I want you to remember is this. It was Abraham's struggle with fear, and God's grace brought him faith. Here's the second idea. Isaac struggled with control, and God's grace caused him to trust. Go with me to Genesis chapter 25. Genesis chapter 25. You remember that Abraham was offered his son Isaac on the altar. So that's a pretty serious step of faith and trust on Isaac's part. But as he aged, Isaac struggled to trust. And I can show you that because of this one passage in Genesis chapter 25. When the boys grew up, remember Isaac had two sons, Jacob and Esau. Esau was a skillful hunter, a man of the field, and Jacob was a quiet man dwelling in the tents. Isaac loved Esau because he ate his game, but Rebekah loved Jacob. Whenever there is favoritism in a family, okay, whenever there is favoritism in a family, there's got to be a controlling parent. Okay? Whenever there's favoritism in the family, and there is here, obviously, one loved one, the other loved the other, there are parents who are vying for control for the best opportunity for the one that they love. Isaac rather, had a control problem. Okay? And so I note that in this particular passage. In fact, God had actually told him, if you're in Genesis 20, 7 there. Go back with me to Genesis 25. God had actually told him what was going to take place between his two boys, but he wasn't willing to listen in this regard. Genesis 25, verse 23. And the Lord said to her, that is to Rebekah, Isaac's wife, listen, why am I struggling in giving birth? And the Lord said to her, verse 23, 2 nations are in your womb, and 2 peoples from within you shall be divided. The one will be stronger than the other, and the older shall serve the younger. Right? There is the answer. Rebekah tells Isaac, listen, I'm going to have twins, and the younger is supposed to serve the older, except for the fact that Isaac likes the older better, Esau. And so in his control, he attempts to make Esau, the one who will be the heir apparent. Here's what we find in that situation. Let me just give you a quick statement from a study Bible. Ignoring the words of God to Rebekah, forgetting Esau's bartered birthright, Esau didn't care about the things that Isaac cared about, and overlooking Esau's grievous marriages, Isaac was still intent on treating Esau as the eldest and granting him the blessing of a birthright, and so arranged for his favorite meal before bestowing finally fatherly blessing on his favorite son, even though God had told him that's not the way God wanted it, right? Isaac is still fighting for control, but God forces him to trust. Using, not causing, but using the deception of his wife and his youngest son, Jacob, remember, who had smooth skin, they end up fooling him, and he ends up giving the blessing to Jacob, not to Esau. You say, what is a blessing? Why is that important? Well, for 2 reasons. In biblical times, the blessing meant that you received the chief of the inheritance. In other words, there was an inheritance idea with it. When I'm going to bless you, Isaac is saying, if I'm going to bless you, even though I bless you thinking you're Esau and you're really Jacob, even though I bless you in that way, when I bless you, you have the rights to the inheritance. Okay? There's another element that's really cool that we wish we could do as parents, but we can't. There was a prophetic element where when the patriarch blessed his child, that he actually, by God's power, would actually prophesy certain things that would happen to him. That is why when Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, when Jacob, known as Israel later, when Jacob blesses Judah, he blesses him and speaks of him as if the Messiah will come from his lineage, and it happens, right? Because by God's power, these men actually prophesy in their blessing. Now, I know a lot of parents, myself included at the time, who would love to prophesy certain things over our kids, right? So, but we don't have that ability in the way that the patriarchs did, but they did. So this blessing thing really, really matters. And if you're not familiar with the story, here's how it happened. Abraham, Isaac. Isaac is the father. He's got 2 sons, Jacob and Esau. He's getting old. He's lost his eyesight. And he says, Esau, you know what I'd really like before I die? I'd like you to go out and bring me some game to eat. I love it when you bring me wild food. Go out and bring me wild food, and then I'll bless you. The only thing is, Rebekah, his wife, is listening on the other side of the tent wall. That probably wasn't very hard, by the way. And she hears that. And remember, Isaac loved Esau, but Rebekah loved who? Jacob. So Esau goes out, and Rebekah runs to Jacob, and she says to Jacob, Jacob, your dad is about to give the blessing, but you can get in there and get the blessing. And Jacob says, Mom, are you kidding me? Have you ever, he can't see. He won't know who I am. He won't know who you are. Have you ever seen the back of Esau's hands? The moment I reach over there, he's going to know, and he's going to curse me. He's going to say, you're not Esau. You're in here trying to steal his blessing. He won't give me the blessing. He'll say, what? Esau, did you start to shave the back of your hands? Like, what's going on, right? And so Jacob says, I can't do that. And she says, here's what I want you to do. I want you, Jacob, to go kill 2 young goats, and I want you to bring me those young goats, and I'll fix them as if it's a wild meal. Now, just think about this for a second. Are these parents who are vying for control? This is a wife who is deceiving her husband on his deathbed. Okay, please, don't ever do that, Kim, all right? Okay, here's the picture, right? You can't even imagine that, right? Like, how bad is this marriage that you'll deceive your husband on the day he dies? Right? So here it is. Jacob says, okay, Mom, I'll do it. He goes out, he kills the 2 young goats. He brings them in. He puts the goat's material in the back of his hands. This is really important. Rebekah goes, his mom goes, and gets him one of Esau's garments, right? This is a total sham. He puts on Esau's coat. He's got hair on the back of his hands, and he brings this wild game in. And the father says, "Why do you sound like Jacob?" You can almost picture Jacob saying, "Sorry, Dad, I guess I got a cold." Okay. But your hands, your smell, you feel to me like Esau, so you must be. So give me the game. He eats it. And then Isaac blesses Jacob under the name of Esau. You say, what? Like, couldn't they get an attorney and recant that, like at the end? Okay. Here's the thing. I think Isaac knew, even though he'd blessed Jacob, I think Isaac knew that that's what God had wanted him to do all along, because he'd already learned that from Rebekah at the moment these boys were born. He vied for control, but ultimately he ended up trusting God in it. There's two more guys. Here we go. Jacob struggled with deception. God's grace brought pain. Okay, now you say, wait a minute. A person who struggles with deception gets pain? That doesn't sound very gracious from God. Right? But it is, and I'll tell you why. Because when we struggle with deception, lying, making somebody believe something that isn't true, when we struggle in that regard, we usually keep doing it because we what? Get away with it. Right? But the moment it surfaces and there's pain in it, we find, by God's grace, the ability to maybe stop doing it. Here's what I want you to see. Jacob deceives his father and steals the birthright. His father finds out about 30 minutes later. But no one knows the pain of deception. No patriarch knows the pain of deception more than Jacob. Because Jacob had 11 sons, and one of them was named what? Joseph. And Jacob believed for over 20 years that his favorite son, remember there's that kind of nepotism thing again, that his favorite son had been killed by a wild animal. He mourned him for 20 plus years. Right? And at the end of that process, he discovers he's alive. You say, well, that would be a great cause of rejoicing. Yeah, it'd be a great cause of rejoicing in one hand, but the other hand, you'd look at the last 20 years and you'd say, man, I totally blew 20 years mourning a son who hadn't died but was alive. Right? In fact, think about this. Jacob's name actually means to grab the heel or to trip up someone. Okay? So it's like you're playing a game and you lost, so you cheated. That's kind of what Jacob was known for. But that's also what happened to Jacob over and over and over again. So here's a quick lesson for you. Jacob's lesson, and this is the truth about lying. If we are willing to lie to someone and break their trust, we shouldn't be surprised when it happens to us. Okay? Just say that with me. If we are willing to lie to someone and break their trust, we shouldn't be surprised when it happens to us. Now, this is one of the most amazing things about people who struggle with lying. You would think that because they lie to other people, they would be really suspicious of everybody lying to them, right? But they're not. I've found that most people who lie to other people have a tendency to be really gullible to people who are lying to them, right? And nobody marks this better than Jacob. He lied to steal his brother's inheritance. He lied in a massive way. And now watch what happens. Just think about this for a second. We know that Jacob was lied to about Joseph, but look at the similarities here. The very same ways that Jacob was lied to his father, he is lied to. The very same mechanisms. Watch this. In fact, in Genesis chapter 27, when Esau finally comes back, this is what Isaac says. He said, "Your brother came deceitfully, and he has taken away your blessing." And Esau said, "Is he not rightly named Jacob?" That is, he trips me up. "For he has cheated me these 2 times. He took away my birthright, and behold, now he has taken away my blessing." Okay, now watch this. The father says, your brother was deceitful. Jacob goes off to another land to get married, and he sees this woman that he'd like to marry by the name of Rachel, and he looks at her and he says she's really beautiful, and her father says, "Listen, you work for me for 7 years and I'll let you have her." you can marry her after you've worked for me for 7 years. And so he works for her for he works for Rachel's father for 7 years, except on the night that they were to consummate their marriage. It's really dark out there, right, in the middle of the desert. And Laban, the father-in-law, says to Rachel, I was supposed to give you to him, but call your older sister over here. Right? I'm just going to slip her in the tent instead. And Leah goes in the tent. Now, just for a moment, think about this. Okay? You wake up the next morning, and the person that you're married to is not the person you thought you were married to, but her sister, right? And Jacob says, what happened? Right? Think about this. Why couldn't Isaac realize that it was Jacob who was stealing the blessing? Why? Because he couldn't what? See. Right? He was left to say, hands are hairy, smells like Esau, I guess this must be Esau. And yet, the very same lie comes back and catches Jacob. In the middle of the night, there is a wife swap that takes place, and he doesn't get his fiancée, he gets her sister instead. The very same way that he lied, he was lied to. But watch this. Back in Genesis 27, this is what Rebekah said to her son. She said, go to the flock and bring me 2 young goats so that I may prepare for them delicious food for your father such as he loves. We'll fool your dad. Right? But look what happens to Jacob much later. Then they took Joseph's robe and slaughtered a goat and dipped the robe in the blood, and they sent the robe of many colors and brought it to the father and said, this we have found. Please identify whether it's your son's robe or not. The very same elements that Jacob lied with, those same elements are what allow them to lie to him. And not only this, look at this one. Then Rebekah took the best of the garments of Esau. Remember this? The best of the garments of Esau, her older son, which were with her in the house, and put them on Jacob, her younger son. Fast forward the tape. Now he's the father of 11 sons. They took Joseph's robe and slaughtered a goat and dipped the robe in the blood, and they sent the robe of many colors. Same thing. In darkness or blindness, 2 goats are used. In the idea that you used Esau's garment to deceive your father, they're going to use Joseph's garment to deceive you as his father. Here's what I want you to know. If you're willing to lie to someone and break their trust, you shouldn't be surprised when it happens to us. One final one. Jacob struggled with deception. God brought pain. Okay? That's actually a healing force for us, the pain is. Joseph struggled with patience, and God sustained the waiting. Joseph is a great story in the book of Genesis. You're going to read his story as you head into this upcoming 2 weeks. Here's what I want you to realize. Joseph had a dream. When he was 17 years old, he had a dream. And in that dream, his brothers bowed down to him. And rather than keep that dream to himself, that's a pretty exciting dream, he went and told his brothers. Okay? Now, if you want to have a good relationship with your brothers, you probably shouldn't tell them one day they're going to bow down to you. Okay? But that's what he did. He probably thought it was going to happen immediately. Like, hey, if I just tell you the dream, guys, you'll stop picking on me and you'll start bowing down to me. Okay? And they said, forget that. You thought we picked on you before? Okay. We're going to sell you and send you off to Egypt. Okay. We're going to get rid of you totally. Okay. Watch this. He goes to Egypt, and you know the rest of his story down there. In Egypt, Joseph waits. God is with him, and so whatever he does, when he works for Potiphar, he just kind of accelerates up the ladder faster than everybody else around him. When he's in prison, he accelerates up the ladder faster than everybody that's around him. But here's what I want you to see. When he actually becomes the one who is in charge next to Pharaoh of all of Egypt, note this, in chapter 41, verse 46, Joseph was 30 years old when he entered the service of Pharaoh the king. And during the 7 plentiful years, that's important because I look from 17 to 30, and I say there's 13 years, and I add another 7. Those are the plentiful years. And I realized that from the moment he said to his brothers, you guys are going to bow down to me one day, right? To the moment it actually happened, is over 2 decades. Right? He's got to wait a really, really, really long time. Now, here's some things that happen when we wait a long time. We get easily discouraged. We get easily frustrated. We get easily apathetic. And I think in many ways the same thing happened to Joseph. Take your Bibles and go with me to Genesis chapter 41. Genesis 41. Actually, Genesis 39. Because I note this in the text, verse 2. This is a great phrase. The Lord was with Joseph, and he became successful. That was always the case with Joseph. And when he is in prison a little later, because Potiphar's wife claims that he assaulted her, and he really didn't, but she claims he did, and so Potiphar throws Joseph in prison. Look at verse 21. And in prison, this is what happens. But the Lord was with Joseph, and I love this next phrase. It's only captured here. And showed him steadfast love. It's almost like there's a parenthetical thing right there, because it goes on to say, and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. That's always the case with Joseph. The Lord was with Joseph, and he got favor. But here it says, and he showed him steadfast love. This is really a cool idea, that at probably Joseph's lowest point of despair, right, in a prison, falsely accused, sold into slavery by his brothers, never thinking that that dream that he had years ago would ever possibly come place. In that moment of time, God shows him steadfast love. Wow, that's great. It's the Hebrew word hesed. It's actually a word that can be understood as loving kindness. It's a word like really no other in the Old Testament. It just means God isn't only love, God is kind, and God reveals that love in the way he responds to us. It isn't just a word. It's so much more than that. And this is what I want you to see. Joseph struggled with patience, and God said, whoa, Joseph, hold on. I will sustain you through the waiting process. I will show you steadfast love through the waiting process. In fact, here we know that he interprets those dreams, and then the guys get out of prison, and it is another 2 years. So for 2 years, Joseph sits there knowing the steadfast love of the Lord. Here's what I love to think about. When his brothers finally come back, is it any wonder he can forgive them? Right? Is it any wonder he can say, listen, you meant it for evil, God meant it for good, that he could save all of these people. He doesn't blame his brothers. He doesn't curse his brothers. He doesn't say, listen, you spend a few years in prison and then we'll talk. Okay? He doesn't do any of that. Why? Because he knew the steadfast love of the Lord during his times of waiting. Here's a couple of questions for you to think about this upcoming week. When you meet in your small groups, you can get these later. Are there attitudes, behaviors that you have picked up from your parents, both good and bad? As you're reading this week, watch that. These guys pick up some stuff from their parents. Okay? Which character, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, or Joseph, do you most relate to, and why? Consider the struggles and growth of these men. In what ways might your spiritual growth help you overcome your personal struggles? So those are some questions for you to think about this week. Here you go. Final thought, here it is. Abraham struggled, Isaac struggled, Jacob struggled, Joseph struggled. And what they got in their struggle was God's grace brought faith. God's grace caused the trust. God's grace can bring pain as a disciplinary measure. God's grace sustained the waiting. While they struggled, God brought grace. Okay?